Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter what time zone you're in. Welcome back to Sip&Talk.
It's wonderful to be here.
I have to say, the coffee blend you chose today is excellent. It smells sophisticated, but there's this distinct edge of, I don't know, dissonance. It really reminds me of how I feel reading the news lately.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, you see Elon Musk talking about AGI taking over literally everything. And then, on the other side of the screen, I'm still waiting for my cheap group buy smart bracelet to finally ship.
Right.
That massive gap between the technological dream and my own personal reality, it's pretty stark.
I wouldn't call it dissonant. This is an Ethiopian Yirgacheffe blend. It's complex, yes, but I'd say it's more calculated. And that same calculated complexity, that applies to what you're describing in global politics, especially with China. I mean, you see them launching these next-generation Long March rockets one day, pushing the absolute boundaries of space exploration, and then the very next day, their officials are at some international forum just, vehemently emphasizing that they are the world's largest developing country.
And because of that, they're demanding trade concessions and climate aid.
Right. It's a strategy. We've talked about this before, how they have bullet trains and skyscrapers going up faster than anyone. But then you look at the GDP per capita.
And it's somewhere around Greece or Portugal?
It's not a contradiction if it's a strategy. It's a highly efficient form of, let's call it, was highly provocative.
Oh, it stopped me in my tracks. It really did. They essentially asked, is it possible? Is it even plausible that the Chinese Communist Party is intentionally keeping the majority of its population relatively poor?
Intense.
Yes, precisely to maintain these international benefits and, maybe more importantly, to enhance their own internal political control.
So you're suggesting they're deliberately keeping people at a kind of economic sweet spot.
Yeah.
Just comfortable enough to avoid major unrest, but also dependent enough to stay compliant.
Exactly.
Wow. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like pure conspiracy theory.
It does. It absolutely does. But then you look at the comparison with Taiwan, a high-income Chinese-speaking democracy, and the difference in how wealth is distributed, how welfare is prioritized. It's undeniable.
Okay.
So I dove deep into the data, and this so-called conspiracy theory, when you analyze it strictly through the lens of power stability, or Wei-Win as their core political logic, it suddenly becomes a highly rational, almost inevitable political economy strategy.
A highly rational political economy.
I like that.
So the idea is that widespread relative poverty isn't some market failure. It's actually a governing tool.
It's a feature, not a bug. And our mission today is to explore the structural and political evidence for this keep the people relatively poor logic and what its massive cost means, both for people inside the country and for the rest of the world.
All right, let's get into it.
Let's sip and let's talk.
Okay, so where do we start with this huge topic?
Let's start on the global stage, because this is where it gets really interesting, how, crying poor actually makes China globally richer. It is a masterclass in global leverage, really, taking your own domestic challenges and turning them into an external asset.
And that entire strategy, it really centers on maintaining this official identity of a developing country. This isn't just about, national pride or political rhetoric. It's a massive economic lifeline, particularly within the framework of the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Right, the WTO advantage. So China joins back in 2001, and they immediately self-declare as a developing nation, and that gets them what's called special and differential treatment, or SDT. Can you break down what that actually means in practice?
Yeah, so SDT basically grants them a structured, institutionalized advantage. It's a set of rules that were designed for nations that are, genuinely struggling to build up their economies. For developed nations, think the U.S., Germany, Japan, even Taiwan. If a new trade agreement is signed, they might get, say, 2 years to implement all the new rules.
Okay, 2 years. That sounds reasonable.
Right. But China, under SDT, often gets much, much longer transition periods. Sometimes it's 4 years, sometimes 6, sometimes even 8 years.
8 years. To adapt to rules that your competitors have to follow in too, that's an enormous head start, especially in fast-moving industries like tech or manufacturing.
It's a massive head start, and it also significantly reduces their immediate obligations. Another huge benefit is with tariffs.
Okay.
Developed nations, their average tariffs are usually somewhere around 7%. For China, because of their status, their average tariffs are closer to 14%.
So that's double.
It's double. That disparity creates this huge protective barrier. It allows their massive, often state-backed industries to grow and scale without having to face full-blown international competition right away. It's an unequal playing field that they get to stand on simply by declaring themselves less capable than they very clearly are.
It's like being a billionaire who insists on using the student discount because they, went to college once 30 years ago. And this advantage, it also shields them from things like anti-dumping measures, right?
Precisely. That's a huge one. If they decide to dump, say, cheap steel or solar panels onto the global market and undercut everyone, their developing status provides a degree of legal insulation. They're shielded from the kind of harsh trade retaliation that a developed nation would face immediately for doing the exact same thing.
And what about the environmental side of things?
Oh, that's another massive area. Under major international accords like the Paris Agreement, developing nations face much higher carbon quotas and far more relaxed emission standards than the West.
So they get to avoid billions, maybe trillions, in immediate environmental compliance costs. They can just externalize those costs onto the rest of the world.
They absolutely do. And when you add all of these advantages up, the longer trade transition period, the reduced obligations, the tariff protection, the environmental avoidance, what's the actual monetary value?
I can't even imagine.
Well, experts estimate the cumulative benefit from just these trade and environmental advantages runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars every single year.
Hundreds of billions a year. That's essentially a subsidy from the rest of the world.
It's a subsidy paid for by the compliance burdens of developed nations and, the environmental stability of the entire planet. Now, to be fair, China recently announced a kind of superficial abandonment of new special treatments in negotiations. They're planning to finalize that in late 2025.
Okay, so they're giving it up.
Not really. It's largely symbolic.
Why is it symbolic?
Because it only applies to future or new negotiations for additional special benefits. It does nothing to undo the massive existing legal identity they hold within the WTO. It doesn't abolish the vast SDT benefits they've already secured over the last 2 decades.
So the established rules, the ones that matter, they stay firmly in place. They just won't ask for more special treatment.
Exactly. They get to keep all the benefits of being a modern economic giant, while also enjoying all the perks of being a global underdog. And that plays perfectly into their foreign policy narratives, especially when they're talking to the global south.
Right, that's the diplomatic angle.
That's the whole other component. By holding onto this identity, China strategically frames historical responsibility for things like climate change and economic inequality as being squarely on the shoulders of Western colonial powers.
Which allows them to demand that rich nations provide climate financial aid while positioning Beijing as a leader, a peer, and a representative of the developing world.
And it lets them criticize what they call Western arrogance. It makes their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, much more palatable to other nations. They're not coming in as a rich Western power imposing terms. They're framed as a fellow developing nation who just happened to succeed against the odds.
It's brilliant. From a geopolitical standpoint, it gives them massive soft power and diplomatic leverage.
And you see the financial absurdity of this playing out in real time. I mean, in 2023, while they were launching their advanced Tianwen-1 space program to Mars and executing these massive high-tech investments at home,
Let me guess.
China still received billions of dollars in World Bank aid.
Wow. Aid that's designed for nations genuinely struggling for basic development is flowing into the world's second largest economy.
Precisely. And to maintain this whole international facade, they have to constantly feed the world data that justifies this self-declared poor status.
And that's where the propaganda math comes in. This is anchored by that famous 2020 statement from the former premier, Li Keqiang.
Yes. The 1,000 RMB figure. A number that sent shockwaves through the system. Li Keqiang publicly stated that 600 million people, 600 million, have a monthly income of only around 1,000 RMB.
Which is what, roughly 140 US dollars?
Roughly. And that figure, which represents nearly half the population, is the essential statistical bedrock for their whole argument. When you calculate the nation's average per capita income, that massive base of low earners drags the average down so significantly
that it becomes statistically easier to argue that the nation as a whole is not yet developed on the global stage.
It gives them the political cover they need to fend off all this international pressure, especially from countries like the United States, whose Senate has repeatedly demanded that China voluntarily withdraw this status.
So it's a strategic calculation. Maintaining a large population in a state of relative poverty ensures they always have the demographic data they need to justify their international status.
And that status secures them billions in financial benefits, and massive geopolitical leverage. It's a political dividend derived directly from the economic vulnerability of their own people. It's really the clearest proof that for the CCP, a certain degree of domestic poverty is an active, functional international asset.
Okay, so that's the international angle. It's efficient, it's cynical, but it makes a kind of cold, hard sense.
Right.
But now we have to dive into the internal logic, the real core of our listener's question. This is where we look at the structural evidence that maintaining economic vulnerability actually reduces the cost of governance, specifically the cost of Weiwen or power stability maintenance.
So we're moving from international policy to, really, domestic political psychology. The fundamental idea here is that people who are living closer to the economic margins will prioritize stability above everything else.
The stability dividend.
Exactly. It's the stability dividend. If you're struggling to pay your rent or cover basic medical bills for your parents, your primary concern is just survival. It's minimum economic growth, just enough to make sure that tomorrow is slightly better than today.
You're not focused on higher-level political demands. Things like freedom of expression, government transparency, real political rights. Those are luxuries you can't afford to think about.
They are. The political trade-off is established very clearly. The government offers a baseline of economic progress, and in return, it receives maximum political obedience.
It's the ultimate carrot and the stick. If you comply, you get to survive, maybe even get ahead a little. But if you dissent, you risk absolutely everything.
And that entire system relies on creating massive dependence in a state that has systematically and deliberately prevented the development of a strong, reliable social safety net. Things like independent unions, robust pension funds. Universal healthcare citizens are forced to rely very heavily on the party organization or state-owned enterprises, the SOEs.
For jobs, for resources, for even basic subsidies.
For everything. So if you step out of line politically, the immediate threat isn't just, getting a talking to. The threat is losing your livelihood, which in that kind of system can mean total economic collapse for you and your family.
So this dependency loop, it means the system actually fears widespread prosperity. You called it the risk of prosperity.
It's the central irony of the whole thing. The system is terrified of a universally wealthy and highly educated society, because that population would inherently demand more. They demand more political rights. They demand transparency on how their tax money is being spent. They demand genuine resource redistribution.
And allowing that level of economic security to spread throughout society would dramatically increase the cost of Weiwen.
Exponentially. The state would need so many more resources for monitoring, for controlling, or, in their worst-case scenario, for actually responding to genuine political demands from an economically independent population.
So keeping the majority economically precarious is just the most cost-effective way to maintain political dominance.
It is. And this precarity isn't accidental. It's not a market failure. It is hardwired into the social contract using tools like the hukou system. We really need to spend some time here because this is just a masterstroke of what you could call structural exclusion.
Yeah, let's break that down. The hukou system.
The hukou, or the household registration system, is arguably the most powerful mechanism they have for enforcing inequality and maintaining that strong state, weak society paradigm. It's a deliberate tool that ties all your public resources, your kids' education, your healthcare, your pension, your social insurance, not to where you live or where you work.
But to where you were born, specifically your original rural or urban registration.
Exactly. So let's say I move from a rural area to a big city like Shenzhen or Shanghai to work in a factory. What am I immediately excluded from?
Pretty much everything that makes life in a city livable.
Everything. You become a second-class citizen in the very city that you are helping to power. The hundreds of millions of migrant workers who drive that economy are systematically excluded from urban benefits. Their children can't easily attend the subsidized urban schools. They can't access the same level of subsidized urban health care. And they have no reliable, transferable social insurance.
On the surface, that just sounds incredibly inefficient economically, but you're saying it's politically brilliant. How?
Because it forces this massive migrant population to accept cheap, low-security labor. And it allows the local governments and the urban enterprises to avoid the huge social welfare spending that would be required to actually support these populations.
So the rural hukou holders are effectively subsidizing urban capital and the state system with their own vulnerability.
That's it. It's a deliberate choice. Prioritizing political control over individual welfare and prioritizing capital accumulation in key urban centers over widespread social fairness.
And this logic of control, it extends all the way to the top, right? It's not just about keeping the bottom weak, but also ensuring the top is always controlled and politically aligned.
Oh, absolutely. That's what we can call the state capture logic. Wealth in China is concentrated overwhelmingly through two channels: state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, or through politically connected private oligarchs. This structure allows the central government to ensure it maintains ultimate control over all the strategic, high-profit sectors: finance, energy, resources, key technology.
If you get rich, you do so at the party's pleasure.
At their pleasure. And the high-profile crackdowns we saw on the tech giants a few years ago, those served as spectacular, very public warnings to anyone who thought that their economic power could ever supersede political authority.
Right. The Jack Ma case, the cancellation of the Ant Financial IPO.
That's the perfect example. The primary driver there was to prevent private capital from becoming too powerful, especially when it came to controlling strategic data and financial systems that could potentially challenge the party's centralized oversight.
The message couldn't have been more clear.
Not at all. It was. Economic success is conditional. Political authority is absolute. The moment private capital grows strong enough to even question the party's direction, it will be immediately and ruthlessly curbed.
So to really quantify this priority, this focus on internal stability over social welfare, we have to look at the actual budget numbers.
This is the most damning structural evidence available, I think. The resources allocated to internal control, the TIA-WIN budget, have consistently, for years, grown faster than the official military budget.
That is just astonishing. Think about that for a second. A state that prioritizes spending on controlling its own citizens over its outward defense capabilities.
And we're talking specifically about the public security portion of the budget. This is what funds the armed police, the massive surveillance systems, the domestic monitoring networks, and the numbers are crystal clear. In 2017, official military spending grew by 7.0%.
Okay.
But the public security budget grew by a staggering 17.2%.
Wow. More than double.
More than double. In 2018, the military budget grew by 8.1%, while public security grew by 16.4%. This gap is consistent over time.
That massive difference, it just confirms the system's ultimate priority. The fear of internal dissent vastly outweighs the fear of external threats. Or at least the cost of managing internal dissent demands a higher rate of investment.
And it's a social deadweight loss.
Yeah.
These are resources that are being diverted directly from public welfare, from building better hospitals, increasing pension funds, improving education for rural kids, and instead they're being poured into suppression and monitoring. This budgetary choice is the clearest, most quantifiable proof you can find that the system is structurally designed to prioritize internal political stability over maximizing the material prosperity and widespread welfare of its citizens.
So we've established that the system actively channels resources towards stability and political control.
Right.
Now, let's look at the specific institutional barriers that prevent middle and low-income Chinese from actually building sustainable, stable wealth, even when the national economy is, on paper, expanding rapidly.
I like the analogy you used before we started. It's like a great engine, but the transmission system is designed to only send power to the tires of the elite.
Exactly. And one of the clearest ways the money gets diverted is through what we can call image engineering, this massive investment in national symbols rather than in people.
Yeah, this is the financial trap. Funds are systematically channeled toward what they call strong nation symbols. Things like high-speed rail, world-leading 5G networks, advanced AI, quantum computing, rockets.
So the things that look impressive internationally.
That's the point. The political goal is to create the illusion of transcending the West. It's a powerful narrative that they use to mask these gaping internal inequalities.
But these investments don't necessarily raise the average person's income or security.
In many cases, they do the opposite. I mean, the data is clear. For 2025, infrastructure investment is projected to exceed 10 trillion RMB. That's about 25% of public expenditure. And this capital is focused overwhelmingly on high-tech strategic projects and, crucially, managing existing debt. It is not going to widespread consumption stimulus or social welfare expansion.
And that obsession with infrastructure is directly tied to the current local debt crisis, which is probably the single biggest drain on potential welfare spending. We should really get into how the system works.
We have to. You have to go back to the 1994 tax reform. Before then, local governments controlled most of the tax revenue they collected. After 94, the central government centralized the majority of tax revenue, but it decentralized all the spending mandates.
So local governments were suddenly responsible for healthcare, education, and infrastructure, but without the tax money to actually pay for it.
Exactly. They were in a bind. So they had to find money elsewhere to fulfill these mandates and, most importantly, to hit those ridiculously high GDP growth targets that the party demanded for career advancement.
And this gave birth to what's known as land finance.
The birth of land finance. Local governments started relying heavily on selling long-term land use rights to developers to generate revenue. They created these off-the-books entities called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, to fund massive, often completely unnecessary infrastructure projects, roads to nowhere, empty industrial parks, all to boost their GDP numbers.
And welfare expansion was just neglected?
Because it doesn't generate short-term revenue. It doesn't look good on a spreadsheet for a local official who wants to get promoted.
So this created a multi-decade boom, but now the music has stopped and they are just drowning in debt.
They absolutely are. The local hidden debt crisis is now estimated to be somewhere between 40 trillion and 60 trillion RMB. That's an astronomical number. So the state is now forced to prioritize saving the financial system and maintaining bond stability above everything else.
And when you have a financial hole of that magnitude, any kind of long-term welfare expansion like robust public pensions or universal health care for migrants, it's just not financially viable, which of course reinforces the population's reliance on the state.
And this financial precarity is amplified by a political system that offers no real security for private wealth.
Right. The political economy of property rights and security.
It's a huge factor. A stable, modern economy requires robust, secure property rights for people to feel safe making long-term investments and accumulating wealth. But in China, the laws have historically defined state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, as the foundation of the economy, and the private sector is merely the supplementary component.
So your private wealth is fundamentally subordinate to state power.
It is. And when a concept like common prosperity gets introduced, it sounds positive on the surface, but for the wealthy, it acts as a tool of deep uncertainty.
It's a political risk mechanism.
It is. While the stated goal was, balancing growth, the implementation was a very aggressive political campaign to curb the disorderly expansion of capital in high-growth sectors. It was a clear message to the wealthy that their assets are conditional on their political compliance.
And the consequence of that kind of insecurity?
It drives capital flight. It discourages long-term domestic investment. And that systemically limits the diffusion of wealth accumulation into the broader economy.
And speaking of capital, let's talk about the SOE crowding out effect. This isn't just a political problem, it's a huge economic inefficiency that prevents widespread wealth creation.
It's a core structural flaw of the system. The state-owned enterprises enjoy what economists call a credit privilege. Because they are state-controlled, they get preferential access to bank financing. They often get loans at lower interest rates and with way less scrutiny, regardless of how efficient or profitable they actually are.
So the banks, which are also state-controlled, are basically forced to fund these politically reliable but often low-efficiency companies, while highly productive private companies are just starved of capital.
Exactly. The private sector, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs that traditionally create the most jobs and personal wealth in any economy, is systematically crowded out of the financing market. Resources are diverted to these bloated, lower-efficiency state departments because they're politically reliable. And that stifles organic job growth and limits the expansion of competitive wages that would otherwise lead to widespread wealth diffusion.
The ultimate vote of no confidence in this entire structural design has to come from the people who benefited the most from it. The elite. Which brings us to the elite exodus, or the run phenomenon.
Yes, the phenomenon.
I mean, if the very people who got rich under this system are now desperately trying to leave, what does that tell us?
It tells us that asset security is paramount, and that their confidence has completely collapsed. China has been leading the world in high net worth individual, or HNWI net loss, for years. In 2024, estimates show that over 15,200 millionaires left the country.
15,000 in 1 year.
And even the projected numbers for 2025, while a little lower, remain astronomically high.
And these aren't just independent entrepreneurs, right? A lot of them are connected to the state itself.
Oh, absolutely. Estimates suggest around 80% of them have direct or indirect ties to the party or the state apparatus. And they are transferring trillions of dollars cumulatively out of the country through overseas trusts, family offices, and investment migration. buying golden visas in places like Europe.
It's a massive capital drain.
The fear must be existential for them to abandon the economic engine that they helped build. It's driven primarily by political uncertainty. They are fleeing the risk of these sudden, unpredictable anti-corruption campaigns or outright asset confiscation under the guise of political rectification. The elite exodus proves that even those at the very top lack confidence in the security of their own assets under the current regime, which further limits the amount of wealth that's actually circulating domestically.
Okay, so we've laid out the political and structural reasons for this concentration of wealth.
We have.
Now, let's just use the hard data to confirm the outcome. Extreme concentration at the top and widespread vulnerability at the bottom.
Let's do it. Let's look at the raw numbers on wealth concentration. Because when you see them, it's pretty startling. According to the World Inequality Database, or WID, the wealthiest 1% of the population in China controls roughly 30.5% of the total national wealth.
30.5%. And just to contextualize that, how does that compare to, say, the United States?
It's comparable to, or in some years even exceeds, the levels we see in the U.S., which is often, held up as the prime example of extreme wealth gaps.
So 30% of the wealth held by just 1% of the people. What about the other end of the scale, the bottom half of the entire population?
This is the number that's truly shocking. The bottom 50% of the population collectively holds only about 1.4% of the total national wealth.
1.4%?
Just think about that. The total accumulated wealth of more than 500 million people is statistically negligible when compared to the concentrated holdings of the political and business elite. This imbalance is so profound it's structural, and it basically prevents any real notion of common prosperity from ever taking hold.
And that massive disparity, it explains why the official GDP growth numbers can feel so meaningless to the average person, because the average is skewed beyond recognition by the super rich.
It's completely skewed, and this feeds directly into the metrics of inequality. Starting with the Gini coefficient for income, the Gini scale goes from 0, which is perfect equality, to 1, perfect inequality. And the number 0.4 is the internationally recognized alert line for potential social instability.
Okay, so what are the official figures for income inequality in China?
The official 2022 Gini coefficient for income, which was provided by their own National Bureau of Statistics, was 0.467.
So well above the alert line.
It's clearly crossing the alert line.
Yeah.
Which confirms that the income gap is dangerously high and is contributing to public dissatisfaction, even if that dissatisfaction is heavily suppressed.
But income inequality is only part of the story. Wealth inequality, the ownership of assets like homes, land use rights, stocks, that's where the real systemic lock-in happens.
That's the key metric. And while they don't publish an official wealth Gini, academic estimates put the household wealth Gini somewhere between 0.70 to 0.80.
0.7 to 0.8. That's incredibly high.
It's astoundingly high. A figure in that range places China among the most unequal nations globally in terms of asset ownership. It puts them in the same league as deeply unequal economies like Brazil or South Africa.
And a wealth Gini that high, it means the vast majority of citizens simply do not possess the assets required to generate generational wealth. It locks them into a precarious existence where their main income source is just labor.
Which is subject to that stability dividend mechanism we talked about earlier. They are perpetual laborers, not asset owners. And while official data is often touted to prove prosperity, we have to look beyond the average to the reality of disposable income and absolute poverty lines.
Let's talk about that. They had a massive political triumph, which was the elimination of extreme poverty.
And it was a massive, successful political campaign. But that success relies on a very low, politically defined standard. China's official measure for eliminating extreme poverty was equivalent to roughly $2.30 per day in purchasing power parity.
$2.30.
Right. And while lifting hundreds of millions out of that level of extreme deprivation is a huge achievement, that very low bar serves the political narrative of success without actually addressing the reality of widespread vulnerability.
So if we apply a standard that's more appropriate for a global economic powerhouse like China, what does the data show?
We can use the World Bank standard for middle to high-income countries, which is $6.85 per day. This is a much more realistic measure of what it actually takes to live securely in a modern economy.
Okay, so using that more realistic standard, what percentage of the population is still in poverty?
A huge chunk of the population remains highly vulnerable. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 17% to 24.7% of China's population, that's around 190 million people, still lives below this necessary threshold.
Almost 200 million people living below the appropriate global poverty line for a country of China's economic size.
Exactly. Yeah, it just proves that widespread economic vulnerability persists, despite the official narrative. And that massive population base, living just above the official poverty line but well below real economic security, is the perfect controllable base for stability maintenance. They have just enough to survive, but not nearly enough to challenge the political system.
You know, this entire discussion about political choices prioritizing stability over widespread wealth, it can be dramatically underscored just by looking at a comparative case study. Taiwan.
Yes.
It's a high-revenue Chinese-speaking society, but its institutional priorities lead to fundamentally different outcomes.
This contrast is so essential because it demonstrates that high revenue can go to the people. It's entirely a question of institutional design and political accountability. It's not about economic capability. Taiwan's democratic framework forces a kind of resource distribution that the mainland system is structurally designed to avoid.
So let's start with something very visible, the tax surplus, a huge difference in fiscal philosophy.
Right. In Taiwan, they have a mechanism that's literally called the tax surplus rebate, which means return tax to the people. In 2024, Taiwan had a massive tax surplus of 528.3 billion NTD. Now, in the mainland, as we discussed, a surplus like that would be funneled into special government bonds for strategic tech projects or for debt management.
But in Taiwan, the political necessity of democratic supervision forces the legislature to give that money back to the public.
That's the key difference, accountability. Legislators know they have to justify how they use that money to the electorate. For example, they passed a special act, the Strengthening Economic and National Security Resilience Special Act, and it allocated funds for a direct cash payment.
A cash payment.
10,000 NTD, about $320 per person, available universally to all citizens and eligible residents without some complex auditing process.
A universal cash payment. That money immediately stimulates consumption and it mitigates the tax burden on families.
It creates an estimated 1% boost to internal demand, and the political logic is transparent. The surplus is treated as an overcollection from the citizens, and so it has to be returned. It fosters trust, and it stimulates the grassroots economy rather than being treated as some state windfall to be used for image projects.
And beyond just cash rebates, Taiwan's universal healthcare system is such a stark contrast to the mainland's low social spending.
Oh, it's night and day. Taiwan's national health insurance, or NHI system, is lauded globally. It has been ranked #1 worldwide for its healthcare index for 7 consecutive years. Coverage is almost universal at 99.9%.
And what does that mean for the average person economically?
It provides massive economic security. It prevents one of the biggest drivers of poverty, which is unexpected medical bills. Out-of-pocket costs are extremely low, usually only 10 to 20% self-pay. Waiting times are minimal. And crucially, the system covers high-cost items like advanced cancer screenings, which guarantees that a major illness will not lead to financial ruin.
And if we compare the spending, China spends about 5.5% of its GDP on healthcare, whereas Taiwan spends about 8%.
Right. And that 2.5% difference might not sound like a lot, but it translates into millions of mainland families facing medical bankruptcy when a disaster strikes. It really highlights the difference between reactive relief and preventative welfare. Taiwan's system is designed to prevent people from falling into poverty in the first place because of a medical crisis.
And finally, there's the comprehensive social safety net that Taiwan maintains.
They use what they call a grid-like approach to welfare, ensuring coverage from cradle to grave. This includes everything from specific child nutrition subsidies and extended parental leave to robust low-income and elderly assistance. Labor stability is also a huge priority. The regulated monthly minimum wage has been raised significantly, and the unemployment benefits are very generous.
How generous?
They offer 80% of your full salary for 6 months if you lose your job.
A 6-month buffer at 80% salary. That is an incredible security blanket for the average worker who's facing an economic shock.
It's the foundation of real economic stability. And the final proof of this institutional choice is reflected in their Gini coefficient, which hovers around a much healthier 0.34.
So much lower than the mainland's 0.467 for income and worlds away from the 0.70 to 0.80 for wealth.
Exactly. Taiwan's system is just designed for greater social equality and preventative welfare. It contrasts so sharply with the mainland's reactive, targeted poverty alleviation, which only focuses on lifting people out of a politically defined, extreme level of deprivation.
The lesson is just so clear. Institutions matter. The presence of democratic accountability and fiscal transparency is what determines whether high national revenue gets spent on rockets and monuments or on healthcare and cash rebates for the citizens.
It's a choice.
That was a really eye-opening dive, and I think it provides a pretty clear answer to our listeners' challenging question. We started by asking if the CCP is deliberately keeping the majority of its people poor.
And I think we found that the so-called contradiction that we see isn't a failure of their system, but rather its efficient strategic design. While there may not be some explicit order from the top to keep people poor, the systematic political choices ensure that wealth accumulation is steered toward the party's center and state strategic goals. Military, high-tech, international leverage, all at the expense of universal, sustainable prosperity.
So the ultimate result of this structural design is that the majority of people are maintained at that strategic equilibrium point. They're just prosperous enough to be satisfied with minimum progress, which ensures internal stability. But crucially, they're kept poor enough to require the state's continued guidance and permission to advance.
The system's greatest fear is not poverty. It's too much independent wealth demanding political accountability.
And the evidence is just overwhelming. The massive wealth, the Gini coefficient, the systematic structural exclusion through the Huqi system, and that enormous Weiwen budget overriding essential social spending. All of it confirms that political control is the ultimate, non-negotiable priority, even if it requires sacrificing the opportunity for widespread, sustainable wealth accumulation.
It really leaves us with a truly existential question for the future.
And that's the discussion point for you, our dedicated Sip&Talkers. It's this. If the economic water stops flowing, if that GDP growth stalls, which we're seeing signs of globally, how long can a political system that is based entirely on minimum economic satisfaction and heavy-handed Weiwen continue to stay afloat? That structural risk is perhaps the most important question that will define global political stability in the coming decade.
And we do want to remind everyone that our discussion has been entirely objective. We've been using international data and research to explore the political and economic structures at play. We focus on critical and independent thinking, and our analysis is not intended to criticize or discriminate against any nation, group, or people.
That's right. As always, we urge you to subscribe to the Sip&Talk podcast for more deep dives. And don't forget to check out our old friend Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life, for some fun memes and the latest travel vlogs.
We'll see you next time.